Welcome to session 11 of Mainstream Apologetics. We're glad that you decided to join us for this session. In this session, we will focus on Jesus' certain death by crucifixion. We will answer the question, how do I know that Jesus died by crucifixion? In our next and final session, we will explore evidence for the resurrection. Gary Habermas, the leading expert on the resurrection, argues that the death, burial, and resurrection are the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. There is a plethora of both extra-biblical and biblical evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus. So much so that we can prove that Jesus died and was raised from the dead, relying solely on secular, non-biblical evidence. We begin this session with the question, why are Jesus' death and resurrection so important? To be absolutely clear, Jesus' death and resurrection are the centerpiece of the Christian faith. It is the central teaching of the book of Acts. In Acts 4:33, we read that the apostles testified powerfully to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. Furthermore, Paul says that the death and resurrection are absolutely essential. In 1 Corinthians 15:14, Paul emphasizes that if Christ had not been raised, then all our preaching is useless and your faith is useless. The bottom line is that if Jesus did not die and rise from the dead to redeem us from God's impending judgment, then we are still lost in our sins. During this session, we will follow 5 lines of inquiry into the crucifixion, death, and burial of Jesus. These include extra-biblical evidence, eyewitness evidence, forensic evidence, secure tomb evidence, and finally, prophetic evidence. We will see that these crucial events are rooted in a wide range of evidence from a variety of reliable sources. Before we can explore evidence for the resurrection of Jesus in our next session, we first need to establish that Jesus died. For if Jesus didn't die, then any discussion of a resurrection is fruitless. In fact, the resurrection would be a hoax. This leads us to our first big idea that we will defend in this session. Jesus died a certain death by crucifixion and was buried in a sealed tomb secured by highly trained guards. First, we establish that Jesus died by crucifixion. Then we establish that Jesus was buried in a secured tomb that was sealed and heavily guarded for 3 days. Together, these two claims demonstrate that Jesus was certifiably dead. In our first line of inquiry into Jesus' death by crucifixion, we focus on extra-biblical evidence, that is, evidence found outside the Bible in secular historic sources. Gary Habermas and others argue that the historicity of Jesus' death and resurrection can be built on extra-biblical evidence alone. This means that Jesus' death and resurrection can be proven exclusively using extra-biblical evidence and not the Bible. We begin with the historic evidence of Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian of the early 2nd century. Tacitus is considered the greatest historian of the Roman Empire. He writes, Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate. And Christus suffered the extreme penalty at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Tacitus refers to Jesus' crucifixion as the extreme penalty. Next, we consider the historic evidence of Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century Greek historian. Lucian writes, a man, referring to Jesus, was crucified. And referring to Christians, these misguided creatures worshipped a crucified sage. Because Lucian wrote critically about Christians, we can consider his testimony both authentic and accurate. Next, we consider the historic evidence of Flavius Josephus, a 1st century Jewish historian who specialized in Roman Jewish history. Josephus writes, Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And they reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Finally, we consider the historic evidence of the Jewish religious leaders. This evidence is recorded in the Jewish Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish oral traditions. It was compiled and inscribed by rabbis Akaba and Mir between AD 135 to 200. The Jewish Talmud records the following event. Yeshu, referring to Jesus, was hanged on the evening of the Passover. In this account, hanging refers to Jesus' death by crucifixion. From these four historic accounts, we make the following observations. First, all writers were anti-Christian and therefore hostile toward Jesus and the Christian movement. Their aim was to discredit the Christian movement that was gaining widespread popularity in their respective regions. Because of this, we can assume that what the writers reported was factual. Second, each of these historians were regarded by their respective governments as the premier historians of their day. Therefore, their accounts were not based on mere hearsay, but the corroboration of multiple reliable sources. Third, Jesus' life and ministry were so provocative that it got the attention of world-renowned historians and their respective governments. Bear in mind, this is before the day of newspapers and the internet. For these events to be recorded in the annals of history, we can only assume that news of Jesus was widely known throughout the Middle East and Southern Europe in the first 2 centuries. And finally, these historic accounts build a reliable profile of Jesus' death and resurrection that is totally consistent with the biblical accounts. Specifically, this profile includes Jesus was condemned to death by Pontius Pilate. Jesus died by crucifixion, which was considered an extreme punishment. Jesus was allegedly raised from the dead 3 days after his crucifixion, and Jesus was subsequently regarded as a sage by his misguided followers. As you can see, this profile casts Jesus and his followers in a bad light. They are portrayed as misguided, deluded creatures. It's fair to say that these historic accounts disprove any notion that Jesus' death and resurrection were the result of church legend. Therefore, we conclude that Jesus was regarded as a factual person by multiple extra-biblical historians. In our second line of inquiry into Jesus' death by crucifixion, we focus on eyewitness evidence. First, we start with the eyewitness account of the Apostle John. John is regarded as a primary eyewitness along with Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. This is because they were present at the foot of the cross at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. John chronicles Jesus' last moments of life on the cross in John 19. From his account, we learn the following. John was at the foot of the cross, placing him in very close proximity to Jesus. John witnessed Jesus' death by the drooping of his head. John witnessed the Roman soldier thrust the sword into Jesus' side. And finally, John bears witness to numerous Old Testament prophecies, such as Jesus' bones not being broken and his side being pierced. John concludes in verse 30, Jesus died on the cross of Calvary. Second, there is the eyewitness account of Jesus' disciples. We read in Luke 23 that all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. This group that stood at a distance represented Jesus' closest friends. This includes many of those who followed him and cared for him throughout his ministry. Remember, they were all in Jerusalem because of the Passover celebration. They too were eyewitnesses of Jesus' death. Third, there is the eyewitness accounts of the general public. Remember, Jesus' crucifixion was a public event. The hill on which Jesus was crucified, called Golgotha, is located on a public road north of the Damascus Gate. We learn from the Gospel of John that thousands of people came to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration. In John 11, John indicates that many people came from all over the country to prepare for the Passover. Because of Jesus' popularity throughout Judea, these travelers were hoping to encounter Jesus. John says that they were continually waiting for Jesus to arrive at the temple. Many expected him to reclaim the throne of his ancestor David. We learn of their intent from the Palm Sunday account recorded in John 12. John indicates a large group of people lined the streets of Jerusalem waiting for Jesus to arrive. When he entered the city of Jerusalem, they took palm branches and chanted, "Hail to the King of Israel." Many of these same people hailing him as king were present at his sentencing, where they shouted, "Crucify him." In Matthew 27, we learn that many of these same people were present at Jesus' crucifixion, jeering at him. Therefore, they witnessed Jesus' deteriorating condition on the cross and his death by crucifixion. From these eyewitness accounts, we conclude that hundreds of people witnessed Jesus' crucifixion and death. In our third line of inquiry into Jesus' death by crucifixion, we focus on forensic evidence. Many theories abound regarding Jesus' crucifixion and death. Perhaps the most popular is the Swoon Theory from the 18th century. According to this theory, Jesus lost consciousness or swooned while on the cross due to extreme exhaustion and then was resuscitated after a 3-day rest in the tomb. To suggest that Jesus could survive the fatal injuries he incurred during the brutal scourging and crucifixion is contrary to the findings of modern forensic science. According to physicians who assessed Jesus' physical condition during his final hours, Jesus would have certainly died from multiple injuries inflicted on him. According to notable forensic pathologist Frederick Zuckerby in his book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, Jesus' injuries led to a certain death. In addition to forensic evidence, the historic record and archaeological remains provide a wealth of evidence regarding death by crucifixion. Let's examine this evidence in some detail. The first of Jesus' injuries occurred in the Garden of Gethsemane. In Luke 22, Luke informs us that as a result of extreme emotional distress, Jesus experienced a very rare condition of sweating blood. This condition is also accompanied by vomiting and dehydration. Additional injuries occurred during Jesus' trial. The first of these injuries occurred when Roman guards mocked Jesus by placing a crown of thorns on his head. We know from medical science that the crown of thorns would have damaged or severed his trigeminal and occipital nerves which served the front and back of his head. This would have resulted in severe facial pain. We also learn from these passages that Jesus was repeatedly struck in the head by a staff while wearing the crown of thorns, further complicating these injuries. Additional injuries occurred when Roman and Jewish temple guards and the Jewish leaders mocked Jesus. From the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, we learn that Jesus suffered multiple blows to the cheek and head. We also learn from these passages that the attending Roman soldiers called out the entire regiment. This implies that there were a great company of soldiers forcibly striking Jesus in the head. These blows to the head would have resulted in severe head trauma, a fractured jaw, and many other facial fractures. And then there was the brutal scourging by the Roman guards. The Roman guards used a flagrum to deliver blows to the victim's back, sides, and chest. Based on the discovery of a Roman flagrum in 1709, we know that the Roman flagrum consisted of a wooden handle, leather thongs, and metal objects at the end of the thongs shaped like dumbbells. As we will see in our last session, the scourge marks on the Shroud of Turin are consistent with the dumbbell-shaped tips found on this Roman flagrum. This scourging would have resulted in hypovolemic shock, which is characterized by heavy blood loss due to lacerations, resulting in a rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure, and shortness of breath. Also, lacerated liver and spleen, punctured lung, fluid buildup in the lung's pleural cavity, periodic vomiting, tremors, and seizures. These conditions were further exacerbated by a half-mile walk to Golgotha, where Jesus carried his crossbeam part of the way. Many of these injuries were so fatal that victims often died before crucifixion. And finally, the crucifixion. We learn from history and archaeology that Roman crucifixion was a form of torture and capital punishment designed to produce a slow death while maximizing the victim's pain and suffering. By all accounts, we know with certainty that crucifixion was fatal. Crucifixion would have resulted in the severing of the median nerves in both the wrists and hands, and the plantar nerves in both the ankles and feet, the piercing of the pleura, lungs, and heart by the sword, resulting in severe hemorrhaging, and finally, an inability to exhale. Jesus' resulting death was caused by a combination of cardiac arrest and asphyxiation. Based on our knowledge of the Old Testament, an acceptable animal sacrifice is one that requires a total loss of blood. For this reason, we know that Jesus fully bled out to satisfy the Old Testament law. Not only did the cumulative effects of Jesus' injuries prove fatal, they left Jesus disfigured. In fact, Jesus was so disfigured, he was unrecognizable. According to the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah 52:14, many were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. The consensus among forensic pathologists is that Jesus suffered a violent and certain death. Jesus suffered multiple critical injuries during his trial and crucifixion. Many of his injuries were fatal and irreparable. To assume that Jesus could walk away from these injuries and appear fully healed 3 days later would be absurd. Therefore, this evidence thoroughly disproves the swoon theory and any other near-death theory. In our fourth line of inquiry into Jesus' death by crucifixion, we focus on the certainty of Jesus' burial and the secured tomb. We learn in the Gospel of Matthew that the Pharisees took every precaution to secure the tomb. The rationale was a distrust of Jesus' disciples. The Bible tells us that they were concerned that Jesus' followers would steal his body and claim that he had risen. After making their case before Pilate, Pilate instructed the Jewish leaders to make the tomb as secure as possible. Pilate's edict is recorded in Matthew 27. Take guards and secure it the best you can. So they sealed the tomb and posted guards to protect it. A Roman guard consisting of 4 soldiers was posted every 8 hours. This ensured the tomb was guarded 24 hours a day for 3 days. Given that the Jewish leaders were at liberty to make the tomb as secure as possible, scholars believe that additional temple guards were posted as well. From these events, we make the following observations. First, because Pilate had the tomb sealed, the Romans certified that Jesus was dead, and that Jesus' body was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Essentially, the Roman imperial seal made Jesus' death and burial official. Second, because Jesus' tomb was heavily fortified with Roman guards, the Romans ensured that nobody could steal Jesus' body. The Roman guards would have paid with their lives if the blockade was broken or the seal compromised. Third, because the Jewish leaders insisted that the tomb be guarded for 3 days, this guaranteed that Jesus was certifiably dead. Jewish law taught that through the 3rd day, the spirit remained in the body, and there was hope of resuscitation of life. However, after 3 days, the spirit departs, and the person could not come back to life. This evidence refutes the objections that Jesus did not really die, and that Jesus' body was never buried in the first place. In our 5th and final inquiry into Jesus' death by crucifixion, we focus on the fulfillment of prophecy. As we discussed in our last session, Jesus fulfilled many Old Testament prophecies regarding his life and ministry. Here we examine how Jesus fulfilled many Old Testament prophecies regarding his passion. Examining the Gospel accounts, we know that there are approximately 20 prophecies about Jesus' passion. The key prophecies are recorded for us in the books of Isaiah, Zechariah, and Psalms. These include: the Messiah was crucified with criminals, the Messiah's hands and feet were pierced, the Messiah's bones were not broken, and finally the soldiers pierced the Messiah's side. Additional prophecies not listed on this slide include the Messiah's price money used to buy the potter's field, the Messiah falsely accused during his trial, the Messiah spat upon and struck during his trial, the Messiah lifted up, symbolizing death by crucifixion, the Messiah mocked and ridiculed while on the cross, the Messiah given vinegar to drink, the Messiah buried with the rich, and soldiers gambling for the Messiah's garments. Technically, prophecy qualifies as circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence relies on inference to connect the evidence to an assertion. While these prophecies don't mention Jesus per se, we connect these prophecies, the evidence, to Jesus' crucifixion, the assertion, because he fulfilled each prophecy with pinpoint accuracy. We will discuss circumstantial evidence as it relates to Jesus' death and resurrection in more detail in our last session. As you can see, these prophecies were completely outside Jesus' control. Therefore, they could not have been orchestrated by either Jesus or his disciples. As we mentioned in our last session, many of these prophecies depict death by crucifixion. Since knowledge of the Roman crucifixion process was not known at the time of the Old Testament writings, the likelihood of these authors predicting these events with pinpoint accuracy is impossible. Therefore, we conclude that Jesus was the suffering Messiah portrayed in the Old Testament. As with our last session, we conclude this session with an Old Testament prophecy that personifies Jesus as the truth. We read in Isaiah 59, "Our courts oppose the righteous, and justice is nowhere to be found. Truth stumbles in the streets, and honestly has been outlawed. Yes, truth is gone." In this passage, we observe the following parallels between Jesus and the truth. The first clause predicts the injustice of Jesus' trial and sentencing. He was falsely condemned by both the Jewish leaders and the Romans. The second clause predicts that Jesus, the divine truth, would stumble in the streets. We learn in 3 of the Gospel accounts that Jesus literally stumbles on the way to the cross, requiring Simon to carry his cross. And then finally, the last clause predicts the death of Jesus. As we come to the end of our session, we observe that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that corroborates the biblical account of Jesus' passion. We have investigated biblical and extra-biblical evidence. We have employed forensic, historical, and archaeological expertise. Therefore, we conclude that Jesus died a certain death by crucifixion. Once again, we want to provide you with a time for reflection. If you're in a group, please discuss these questions. Otherwise, please answer these questions individually.